Before we start today's session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're gathered on, the very first storytellers of this nation. Also today, you will see to my right the photos on stage of Thai playwrights, and this is about the PEN Empty Chair. PEN was founded in 1921 to act as a powerful voice on behalf of writers harassed, imprisoned and sometimes killed for their views. The empty chair on stage is a symbol adopted by PEN International to represent the writers who cannot be with us because they are imprisoned for their writing. Thai student playwrights Patiwat and Portnip are in jail because of a play they wrote. They were found to have contravened Thailand's lèse-majesté law. The charge of lèse-majesté criminalises alleged insult of the monarchy under the Thai criminal code and is commonly used to silence peaceful dissent. To find out more, go to pen.org.au, and I feel very strongly about this. I'm the president of PEN Sydney, and so I'm very pleased that we are acknowledging the writers who can't be here. So on to today's topic, which is Reading Australia. I want to be brief in my introduction to it. It's a big idea. And the idea came from the then chair of Copyright Agency in the Cultural Fund, Byron. And I want to dedicate this session to Byron. He died on the 1st of January, but my goodness, he was pleased with what we were doing with Reading Australia. When we started this, it was an idea in 2009, and we were down at the National Library. The National Librarian was showing off the brand new Trove. It had been launched the day before. And for those of you who don't know, Trove is an online archive where the National Library has digitised many things in its holdings, from manuscripts, photos, letters, interviews, all sorts of things, and it's fantastic. And they had shown us some of the things that they'd digitised to make available. Brian said, "Zoe, take it for a test run." So I said, well, why don't we key in Patrick White? You know, he's an Australian Nobel Prize winning author. And there were 10,000 search results, and 4 of the top 10 were about US agricultural pumps. Brian said, bit of a problem. And at the same time, there was a lament going around from literary critics like Geordie, Michael Hayward, the publisher, and various others saying, why is it that you can go to university, study English, and not encounter an Australian book or an Australian writer? And also a problem with schools that while you definitely studied Australian books, they were often the same books year in, year out. So Brian sat back, as he does, and he just put the two things together. He said, we will create an online website, and we will bring together great digital content with some of Australia's best writing, and we'll do it for teachers. It was a vague idea, but it had a definite purpose. Then the work of actually working out how that would come into being was what we were all busy with, and we formed a group with tertiary academics, teachers, the Australian Society of Authors and others. First thing was the list of books, and it was just an initial list, and we asked the ASA Council, and they are senior writers from all different genres of work, come up with 200 books or titles, they don't have to be books, they could be other things, that you think Australian students should encounter if they want to know about Australia. Key themes in our history that shape who we are today and probably will shape our future as well. They sat down, there were 2 days worth of meetings, and on that council, included in that were Anne Devison, Tom Keneally, Frank Morehouse, Rosie Scott, and many others, and it was a very heated discussion as they went about deciding what went on that initial list. Very quickly they said it can't just be fiction, it's got to include non-fiction, it must include children's books, and so we had a very wide mix. I always wanted it to raise a lot of questions and criticism from people, but it was actually very well received when we announced it to the world. That was our beginning, and that was never supposed to be a closed set. We are building and developing that list all the time with advice from experts. Then we said, well, what do we do with this list? And we talked to teachers at tertiary and secondary level, because that was where we were trying to fill a gap. And they said a new national curriculum is coming in. How about create teaching resources for English teachers that will help them to navigate the new curriculum all around Australian books on your list? So that's what we do. And today we've got about 140 books with resources. They're very comprehensive, teachers like them. And in the secondary area, we've had writers from across the country writing about Australian works and saying, why would I look at Catherine Susanna Pritchard today? What on earth is of interest in Coonadoon? And many other things. So that's a very big bit of the background. We've got about 7,500 subscribers now who are teachers. We'd like that to be many times more, but it's not a bad start. And we look at our Google Analytics and we have about 50,000 people looking at the site each month, and so that's not bad. Anyway, that's the very big idea, and now I am going to bring in the panel. First up, I want to introduce Geordie Williamson. Geordie started his professional association with books as a bookseller, is an acclaimed literary critic. Till recently, he was the chief literary critic for The Australian. He won Australia's National Prize for Critical Writing, the Pascal Prize, in 2011. This year, he's jumped from the role of critic to the role of publisher, taking on the role of running Picador. In a way, Geordie wrote the book that explains at least some of why we started Reading Australia. And that is this book, The Burning Library. Can I commend it to all of you? It's very interesting, terrific, still as relevant today as when it was first published, or maybe not, with Reading Australia. And I'll read a little quote right from the start. This book is inspired by anger and hope. The anger comes from watching as an Australian literature is dismantled by the people charged with preserving the best of our writing for future generations. And the hope? It grows out of a sense that neither academics nor publishers will rescue our collective literary achievements. It falls to ordinary readers to do what they cannot. And so I'm going to start with the obvious question. Geordie, you wrote The Burning Library some years ago now. How do you think we're travelling in terms of preserving and valuing and celebrating our local writing?
Thanks, Zoe. I just want to start by saying I, as a bookseller, working my way through my undergraduate degrees, my best customer was this big, avuncular, hugely intelligent, enthusiastic man who would come in and just buy books by the pile. And his name was Byron Johns. And we had conversations over the years, very inspiring ones, about Australian lit. He didn't tell me that he basically used to run Penguin and published many of the books that I was raving about. And so, yes, my interest in Auslit was literally inspired by John, and I think he would be thrilled to see what's happened with Reading Australia. But to answer your question, Zoe, I actually think my timing was absolutely rubbish. I was pushing against an open door. And I think it's often the case, isn't it, that the point where you make a complaint is the point where people are actually acting to rectify it. Yeah. So I published The Burning Library in 2011, the end of 2011. And since that time, I've seen an explosion of interest in the Academy for Australian Writing, sincere efforts to actually bring the insights of the Academy to a broader public. Things like the Sydney University's series of contemporary writers on Australian classics, and things like Reading Australia, which are undertakings by the publishing community. And here I should give honourable mention to the Text Classic series. Michael Hayward deserves enormous credit for having the vision and the guts to go out and literally return to currency a large number of otherwise forgotten Australian works. And it has had a profound effect. Elizabeth Harrower is just one instance. This is a woman who was basically out of print. She wasn't in the Macquarie Pen Anthology of Australian Literature, which is the most comprehensive brick of an anthology that we have. And she was basically living forgotten in a flat on the North Shore of Sydney. And last year, you may have seen that James Wood wrote a long and admiring review of her most recent novel in The New Yorker. And every book of hers is back in print. She unfortunately says she's too old now to enjoy the adulation, but nonetheless, we can enjoy her books. So I'd say that great work has been done by Cal, by Text, and by others. And I don't think I was wrong in suggesting that I guess the neoliberal moment is one in which we're all encouraged to be transnational because borders don't matter to the flow of money, therefore they shouldn't matter to anything else. And for publishers, the revocation of our parallel importation laws, which have allowed us to actually create an Australian literary culture and been very successful at it, is an indication of how these borders coming down are meant to be something good, but there are all sorts of unintended consequences. I think that there are public goods for celebrating Australian literature, for having stories that reflect our own spaces and our own lives back at us. Much as I love literature from elsewhere in the world, and will always, sort of have a love of the exotic and the other, those stories are utterly necessary. So yes, I was both right and wrong, and I am more angry than I was in 2011, but more hopeful too.
That's good. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Moya Costello. Moya is a writer and lecturer in writing at Southern Cross University. Moya's been awarded writers' grants, a residency, fellowships and guest spots at several writers' festivals. Her book-length works are 2 collections of short creative prose and 2 novellas, the most recent of which is Harriet Chandler, which Nick Jones described in the Sydney Review of Books as a beautiful, brilliant book. Short works have recently been in the Griffith Review and 4 anthologies from the Sydney prose poem and microfiction publisher Spineless Wonders as well. Moya didn't want me to mention this, but I'm really fascinated by the fact she also writes 2 wine blogs. And as a lover of wine, I was very pleased to hear that. Talking about local product. Great. Moya, as an academic, how significant is Australian literature now? What time or proportion of teaching is allocated to local literature at your university and by you?
I think Australian writing is really of critical importance to us teaching in the academy. As Geordie says, it tells us who we are and it tells us about the place we live. There's something in academia called a teaching research nexus. And for example, I have an interest in Murray Bale, and we teach Murray Bale, and that book that Nick Jose referred to is called Harriet Chandler, who's a minor character in Murray Bale's Holden's performance. But there are other lecturers at SCU who are interested in, say, Alexis Wright, Carpentaria, and do research on her, or, for example, Australian Gothic and Rosa Parade and Barbara Bainton, to mention a couple of 19th century writers. So if you want stats, and I'm not necessarily numerate, I'm literate, but the quick answer is that we do just over half of the texts we look at are Australian. It's probably critical to mention that at SCU, as a kind of young university, we don't have English as such, whereas somewhere like Sydney University, which is called a sandstone, a very traditional kind of old, wealthy institution, still has an English department, as does the University of Adelaide. And in fact, as Geordie said, Sydney has a chair in Australian literature. But we do it through creative writing. Now, at SCU, ideas and theory are critical to teaching creative writing. So even though the subjects we study and teach are divided between what are kind of practical subjects where you teach the skills of creative writing, and then there's a set of reading units, which is about kind of literary criticism. In both in the practical and the reading units, we read. If you want a breakdown of those stats...
Oh, if you can do it.
Say we've got 3 reading units, and in the first unit out of 5 texts, only 1 is Australian, and that's Dovie's Only the Animals. I mentioned that because she's here at the festival this year. In the second one, I think it's about... of 7 texts, 4 are Australian, and 1 is Kim Scott's That Dead Man Dance, as an Indigenous writer. And in the final kind of upper level unit, there are 5 texts, and all of those are Australian. And in a practical unit like short story writing, where students have a selection of about 30 readings to do, over half of those are Australian. So I think we're doing pretty good.
Thank you. That's great to hear. And to introduce Tara June Winch. Tara June is a writer who's Australian but living in France at the moment. She's a columnist, essayist and author. The Sydney Morning Herald named Winch among the best young Australian novelists in 2007. Her first novel, the multi-prize winning Swallow the Air, was one of the very first books to be put on the Reading Australia list. And then once it was on the list, it was the one that the teachers said, we definitely want teaching resources around this book. And Melissa Lukashenko wrote an essay about it. So Tara, whether she knew it or not, was one of the very first people involved in Reading Australia. Tara, and I should explain, Tara arrived from France, I think 2 days ago. So little jet lag, but I think doing well. She's up on stage and awake. As an author in an increasingly globalised market, one in which the Melbourne writer Hazel Edwards claims authorpreneurship is absolutely essential for authors to build their reputations, do you think Reading Australia is important, or that it would help you?
For sure, definitely. In terms of teacher resources and in terms of the way that even, I think the website is accessible and the language is not so academic that even students and Year 11, Year 12 students doing their HSC can access and understand the website and navigate it quite easily. I think can I make recommendations?
Of course.
Is there an application for Reading Australia? I think an app would be good.
Right.
And sorry, critiquing. And more of video content, because I think that's the way to... it's fantastic for teachers, but for readers and for students, it seems a bit... I've lost all my English words as well because I live in France. Yeah.
Multimedia.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think just video is more engaging for students. So, and I like the fact that this is filmed and going to be...
Well, and this is part of our delve into the multimedia and the video is to record this session and put it up on the Reading Australia website.
So we had a discussion about she's investigating the possibility of more film content.
Yeah. Oh, but it's so hard. It's so hard to be what was the quote that entrepreneur?
An entrepreneur.
It's so hard. Why can't we just write?
We're trying to do that for you.
That would be nice, and it's so nice to have that platform in a way, because the writer has so much responsibility these days to do video content, to do social media, to get up on a stage on a lectern, which is the most unnatural place for a writer to be. There's no way that this was part of the reason why you want to sit in a room alone all day and take the phone off the hook. Fair enough. So it's a fascinating time actually being a writer, and it's changed so much in the last 10 years when I was here at Byron Writers Festival, of course. I wonder, Geordie, why you said that you were even angrier now and just as hopeful because of the interest like the Stella Prize and because of things like Reading Australia having an involvement and promoting Australian literature?
It's a really good question. I mean, the reason that I'm angry and I think everybody should be, is that publishing in Australia, this ecosystem of authors and publishers and booksellers and those apparatuses like CAL that seek to assist them are being basically laid waste to. Because the fact is that we don't have enough money as a nation to pay for certain things. Something's got to go first. There's always fat to trim, isn't there? And the first thing to cop it are the arts, because, I mean, who cares? But the problem is economies of scale. When you go to a large portion of the economy and reduce your funding to it by a certain amount, if it's large, it can deal with those reductions. But in the case of something like Trove, where you've got 4 staff and you say, okay, we're getting rid of 2 staff, that's not a small cut, that's destroying it. And that's what's happened to our research libraries. I was at a symposium for Peter Porter at the National Library in Canberra the other day. They made the most substantial purchase of papers they've ever done for an Australian literary figure. There are scores of boxes of one of the great Australian poets of the 20th century. They can't even afford a publicist to let you know that they're there. They haven't been able to sort them yet. They're waiting for funding from private philanthropic organisations in order to be able to go through these papers. This disgusts me because I think that it is a kind of philistinism that is I mean, I'd go so far as to call it, it's a spiritual blight. And you can see it in the coarsening of our public discourse. You can see it in the flattening of our ability to be able to argue in a civil way, in a thoughtful way, in the public sphere. So, in answer to your question, I'm angry about the destruction of what people like yourselves have actually devoted their lives to, underpinning. I'm hopeful because, in spite of all of this, Australian writing has been never stronger. I'm so excited constantly by what is, appears on my desk. Only the other day, I had Kim Scott's new manuscript, and this is the fun of being a publisher. You get to see these things early, of Kim Scott's new novel, his first in half a decade, and it is a jewel. And the excitement of knowing that there is someone like Kim at work today writing about the reclamation of language for his people, the Noongar of WA, is exhilarating. It's a story of survival. So on one hand, there's the misery of our current predicament. On the other, there's Kim Scott. And if he can be hopeful, then we can all be hopeful.
Yep. And I wanted to jump in because I think we're talking about policy there and arts policy. And of course, Copyright Agency has been an organisation that started as a big idea and has evolved into quite an important part of the industry. We now collect and distribute about $120 million a year that goes back to Australia's authors and publishers. We're a not-for-profit and we're owned by Australia's authors and publishers. We too are under attack. We have a session this afternoon on fair use, which is an American copyright doctrine that the Productivity Commission has suggested we adopt in Australia. We are viscerally opposed to it, and we look to our Canadian colleagues for why we're viscerally opposed. But anyway, that's a long conversation for this afternoon, but we feel very, very passionately about that at Copyright Agency. I have a second question for Moya, and I'm hoping to build a bit of critical feedback for us. Do you see gaps in the Reading Australia list, Moya? And if you do, what are they?
Actually, I don't. It's a fantastic resource, and one of its great qualities is that it covers all genres. It does creative non-fiction and more something like non-fiction as well as fiction. And what are you going to do when you put an anthology together? I'm sure there are people critiquing the text classic series too. I mean, I look at there and I think, oh, why wasn't that there? Why didn't they select that? So in a selection process, things have to be left out. If you wanted me to say something, contribute to that question, one of the things I'm quite interested in is art criticism, and probably because of Murray Bale, but not only Bale. He's written one of the best monographs in art ever and it's on Ian Fairweather. So that kind of writing too. Someone like Philip Drew, who has written on Glenn Murcutt, the architect, and his first in a trilogy or a set of 4 books was called The Coast Dwellers, and I think that's really still very much about Australia, how that idea that we live on the coast and the centre's still sort of something like that. So those kinds of books that spread thinking about Australia just a bit further, but it's a fantastic resource.
Thank you. And I've got to say, listening to those suggestions, I know Brian Johns would love both of those. They're right up his alley. And Tara, responding to your thing about making works accessible on the Reading Australia site, one of our desires with the essays for the secondary area, we have said very definitely to the people we've commissioned to write those, which are a combination of critics like Geordie, writers, and some academics only if they can write in plain English, was to say we don't want academic pieces. We want personal responses. We want things that would engage students, general readers and others. And for us, they have been the wildly successful part of Reading Australia, that people and teachers say to us, gee, I really loved reading, the essay about this or that, but I can also show it to my students and say, an essay doesn't have to be a really boring, scrappy thing that you hand in on a Tuesday morning. You can actually say a lot of things and there's no really set pattern to them. So that's one of the things we started out thinking. Multimedia content, of course, and video material, we're investing in that in different ways. We have a partnership with the ABC. We interviewed 10 of the authors on the Reading Australia list, got Tom Tilley from Triple J to do the interviewing. We're entering into another partnership with UTS for some stuff in the tertiary sector and interviews, and looking with ABC at some more primary school-aged works. But my question for you, Melissa Lukashenko wrote an essay on Swallow the Air. What are your thoughts about that? Is it helpful as a writer to read another writer's response to your work? And does it matter to you that she's an Indigenous woman? Does it give her response any extra meaning to you?
Melissa Lukashenko is someone who I've looked up to for years and really respected, and as a person and a writer. So for her to write, and it was a beautiful essay, about my work and look at it in a different perspective and look at it in a really feminine perspective that I hadn't even thought of before was really touching. I remember I was crying in front of the computer reading it, and she said something that really stuck with me, that even though I'd written about really dark topics in Australian life and in Indigenous life, that I wasn't. She said she was no grunge writer. She's no grunge writer. I had to look up grunge again. I had to really think about it to figure out that it was a compliment in like a really cool way. Yeah. Is Melissa's not here?
She's at the festival. There she is.
Oh, sorry. But it was really touching, and I've had feedback from other students that have read it. I've got it on my website actually, which is nice. So that if students sometimes get in touch, because my book's on the HSC, that if they get in touch personally, sometimes they do, can you please look at my essay?
And what's the answer?
Can you look at Melissa Lukashenko's essay? I send it straight to them.
Also, we're dealing with some of that workload as an author.
Thank you.
You just, we're like a mailbox. That's great.
But as someone who's written one of these introductions, it's actually really valuable for the critic as well. I mean, you gave me A Fortunate Life, which I hadn't read since school.
Yeah.
So I came to it with fresh eyes, and it was actually a riveting book. Not as that kind of, I think it was a very popular, I think it was its popularity initially was about a sense of national pride. It was the Anzac myth and what have you. But when you read the book again, it is a profound critique. That man was so broken by his experience at Gallipoli that the rest of his life, he's such a strong man before and such a broken man afterwards. And his sense of civic engagement, I had forgotten as well. He sort of embodied a kind of decency which I think that we're increasingly nostalgic for. But what really haunted me were those early years talking about his hard scrabble, existence on marginal country in rural WA. And I started doing some Googling around where were the Indigenous people in this story. At the same time that he's sold into slavery, the local people had been moved onto reserves. So the story that shadows A.B. Facey's is the story that is not told. And it is always worth returning to these books and trying to investigate those parts which may have not been in focus 20 years ago, but are coming into focus now. So I'm grateful for that experience. Thank you, Zoe.
Can I add something as well?
For sure.
Because I actually got to critique Ruby Langford Ginnaby, who was from this area. Her first, I think it was the first book in the series of autobiographies, Don't Take Your Love to Town. And I had read it before I was the mother, but having given the opportunity, I read it again. It was so amazing. It was such an incredible experience, so transformative. And I think I'm not sure if you've read the essay for the website, but this must be read. It's so important. It's such an important text, and it was so overlooked. So many people that I'd talked to hadn't heard of it, unfortunately. But yeah.
I guess
fantastic.
As the person who's been involved with Reading Australia since day one of the things that was very important was who we got to set that very first list. And it's a really hard job. It's finding anthologisers that people will have confidence in and that you think will do a good job. And I'm really pleased we settled on the Australian Society of Authors Council. And this is not meant in any way as a criticism, but they are a very senior lot. And Gavin Suter, bless him, was 94 in the room talking, and he was talking about non-fiction. But the thing I think was really interesting about that was they had a very long view of Australian literature. And I think the list was very influenced by that. And when we got the academics at tertiary set to come in, they said, wow, that's really interesting, and some of these early books hadn't heard about. So I'm so pleased we used them, and now we're bringing in other people to give us advice, but that groundwork that they did, and it relied on their extraordinary knowledge, collective knowledge of Australian writing.
But it's not only... Sorry, Molly, you go, please.
Among the things that we would use at university in those essays are something like Ho Pham, who's a kind of rising Vietnamese Australian author, and an essay on Tom Cho. He's been a guest at the past Byron Bay Writers' Festival, and we teach a story of his. We'd look at Patrick Allington on That Dead Man Dance, and Zoe's own poet mother, Judith Rodriguez, on Barbara Bainton. At SCU Writers, actually, we train writers to write about their own work, to critically reflect on their work, but they also then have to talk about another person's work who's been influential to them, and they have to do literary criticism on other major texts. So those kinds of essays are really useful as models for...
And can I say, the Look Who's Morphing, now that ASA Council put that book on the list, and I think it's one of the most fresh pieces of writing. It's called Morphing. And Hua Pham's essay is fantastic as well. But, that kind of diversity on the list excites me. Geordie, now you're a publisher, you've jumped the fence, you're part of the lot you were really angry about. What's your responsibility in that role? And this might be a very obvious question.
It's like you hang around the bar long enough, they invite you to come around and pull a few beers. So that's what I'm doing now. What is my responsibility? I think about, and we've sort of talked about it glancingly, the breadth of the Reading Australia list. Why are we dealing with children's lit, with non-fiction, and you were suggesting art criticism, along with novels? Because in an English context, you just say, well, we'll have the great English novels. This is the truth of our literature. It's an unstable tradition, and the novel is a European tradition that's just been plonked down in an entirely alien landscape. And when you think about the height of the novel, the 19th century English novel, for instance, it's based on extreme class differences. It's based on concentrated populations in small areas with settled gradations in caste and class and you name it. It's of no use to us. And you can read Australian literature as a gradual coming to terms with the fact that we must find forms appropriate to our place. So my responsibility as a publisher is to try and draw into that charm circle of books that hopefully you will all go out and buy and read, a sense of the possibilities of a genuinely local Australian literature. And I think that there is just no more exciting project for any country to have than to do that. And that is something which includes I think the greatest untold story in our literature is that it was actually operating for 40 or 50,000 years before many of us landed here. Yeah. And what we don't know, what I didn't know, was when the first fleet sailed into Sydney Cove at the point where the Opera House is now, were giant white mizens. They were enormous. They were several story buildings high. And because they hadn't thought to bring enough lime to create the buildings, they used these middens in bricks for all of the colonial era buildings. So that image for me is a potent one. Parramatta Road, which I travel down, I commute to work from the Blue Mountains to Sydney each day, and I travel along an old track that has been used for tens of thousands of years. These kinds of stories I would like to draw in to that broader, selection of stories that we have. So I feel it as both a heavy and a glorious responsibility. And also I have to go into a room and they say, but how many copies will it sell? Yes. So there are my dreams and there are the exigencies of the marketplace.
Can I just say, I saw a quote from you, Geordie, when you just got that position saying you had an interest in nature writing. And I want to say that we see that in the Academy as critical, eco-critical writing as one form of saving the planet. And in fact, Jessie Cole, the book that you launched last year, was it?
2 years ago.
2 years ago, Deeper Water, she's one of our students, that has an eco-critical bent. So I was really pleased to see that idea of nature writing.
Nature writing involved in fiction?
No, well, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, for those of you who are interested in contemporary writing of place, nature writing's a slightly unfortunate umbrella term that we use for lots of books that don't really fit. But you can see how genre breaks down when you start looking around and removing basically, here's our story. We're talking to ourselves. We are a species that happens to run the entire planet. We've entered the Anthropocene. We and domestic animals that we eat make up something like 95% of the biomass on the planet. And what we've done is we've insulated ourselves from a sense of nature. So we talk to ourselves and amongst ourselves. So the novel is a social document. It's about people interacting. I'm fascinated by people rediscovering the world beyond them. And I think those encounters can be just as dramatic and filled with incident as a novel. Now, the problem is that because we're a highly urbanised society, it's often the case we don't get to see the world beyond us. So the importance that Moya is pointing to are those reports from elsewhere that a really fine nature writer can give us. So yes, when I have the opportunity, I think that's the kind of book I'd like to publish.
Now, I want to close with a question to each of the three panellists, the same question. Do you think at tertiary level, university level, we should have a sort of foundation in Australian literature course for students, a Reading Australia course? Moya, I guess you first.
It's kind of my inclination not to suggest, how people should live or do anything. So, although there would be a case surely for schools, university is a slightly different field, I think, where you can't put those kinds of impositions on as a compulsory kind of. Students too, I think, it's a problematic life for students. They're poor, they have tertiary fees, they can't buy textbooks. The kind of socio-economic kind of student we have at SCU. So a kind of compulsory course I don't know about, but we still do our best.
A compulsory free course.
Yeah, way.
Of course, it should be supported by the government.
Yeah.
And
We
with
would
the
do
free
that then.
text involved.
Yeah, we would do that.
As long as I get royalties. I think it's a fantastic idea because I came to Australian literature as a reader late, and I'm actually only just reading Cloud Street at the moment. I would have loved to have had that basic level, like these are the 10 texts that are most, maybe in nature writing and non-fiction and poetry and even in children's books and novels and short stories, keep going on. But having that foundation, like a pack that you're provided with to have a better understanding of where you fit in Australian history, because it wasn't taught properly when I was at school. I think Australian literature and Australian history, and it just sets you up. Even if you're not going into a creative field, it sets you up in this being Australian and the issues of identity living here.
Well, I've got to say, I was an honours English student at Melbourne University in the early 90s, and I could have gone through, and English was my main thing, I could have gone through and never looked at a single Australian writer, and I could have focused entirely on the Bloomsbury set if I'd wanted to for 4 years. I didn't, and I've got an interest in Australian writing, but I studied with some US students who came over from UCLA on exchange when we were in our honours year, and they said, oh, but in the US you have to do a foundation course in US literature. Why wouldn't you? I mean, that's your local literature. Geordie.
Well, I think you get into all sorts of questions of canonicity, don't you? Because you say, okay, here's a compulsory course, and what are you going to put on it? And this has been very vexed. And so for a long time, particularly in the academy, the thought was, well, let's just leave it to the side because it's too fraught. But I think as long as we leave, as long as we're generous in what we include in these lists, we leave the canon open as possible and loose-limbed, then I think it's perfectly, legitimate and worthwhile undertaking to have that underpinning. But a part of me also thinks that we should probably ban Australian literature. That's what would make it exciting.
Then it become really sexy.
It's like, isn't it like what was the culture that punished marital intercourse with death, which actually, had the perverse effect of making it very exciting. Perhaps that's what we should do, because Auslit is a very, at its best, is a pretty anti-authoritarian beast.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and we'll punish by death.